In this video, we're going to address a subscriber question. You can pause the video and read the question details, but essentially we're going to be going in to create a dynamic legend that is custom. And so in this question, they're asking to flag BDD elements, which is telling me that it's stuff like a block, and then blocks are going to have value properties such as end of life and beginning of life. These beginning of life and end of life value properties are going to have years like 2003, 2025, 2030 to explain when that part is going to be able to be used. And so we want to be able to create our example here and then have our legend, which is going to flag all of the pieces of hardware that you see down here in the physical elements section. It's going to flag them and say, yes, in 2025, these green blocks are good. So here's where we want to go, where we have this is active, and we've done basically some complex MetaChains that are going to say, if the beginning of life is before the current year, which is 2025, and the end of life is after the current year, 2025, then set it to green. And then I've got a special one for the legacy elements or the old elements. It's just saying if the end of life is before the current year, 2025, then flag it as gray. And I've got this IMU one down here, which would be a future element saying that the beginning of life is greater than the current year, 2025, then, set this to true. And then I've got this guy that's saying this is the last year it's going to be available. So if the end of life year equals 2025, then set it to yellow or true. And then I've got some just basic, logical elements flagging and abstract element flagging, which was really not part of the question here. But we'll go into the details of these MetaChains right now. So now we'll go through the MetaChains one by one. We'll start with the logical elements, which is essentially just pulling all of the contents or blocks within the logical architecture package. So if I go to the elements by condition, you'll see the MetaChain here. So we use this contains operation, and then we've got a filter and object this is going to be all the blocks that are on this BDD diagram. That's what this means. So if any of these elements that are within the logical architecture package, any of these blocks also are on this diagram, then it will be flagged as light blue. So that's really it. So I got blocks within logical architecture package, and then that right there using the contains relationship. So for the next one, the abstract element, I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm just using the abstract elements package instead of the logical architecture package. So if I go to my contains relationship into my search, instead of having the logical architecture package underneath the scope here, I've got the abstract elements package. Everything else remains the same. So that's the first two. The is active, this is probably the most complicated one. So we're going to go to elements by condition. So we're using the AND operation. So I've got two operations in here. So both the first one and the second one must be true in order for the total to be true. So the BOL, beginning of life, must be less than 2025, and the end of life must be greater than 2025 for the green to be set to true. And so if I'll go into that first one, I've got a MetaChain and then this integer of 2025. So what I'm doing right here is I've got a find and then another MetaChain. So I'll start with the block, and then I'm going to the owned attribute of that block. I'm looking at the value property of that goes with that block. And then I will be filtering by BOL. So I'm finding all of the beginning of life value properties that are within the blocks on this diagram. That's what I've done so far. And then I have my BOL value properties, default value, and then I can get the literal integers value, which would be, if I'm looking at this guy, it would be 2022. So I'm taking 2022 and 2025, and I'm saying if 2022 is less than 2025, then set to true. So that one's true. And then we'll do a similar, we have the greater than one here. So I'm using the greater than action here, behavior, which can be found if you just hit the dots and you've got this opaque behavior list that you can navigate through. So I got the greater than or equals, and we got the less than or equals. So I'm just using the one that makes sense. And we'll do the same sort of thing here, where we start with this, which is all the blocks on this diagram, and then we'll go from the block to the owned attribute and then just getting the value properties that are attached to the block. And then we're going to filter all the value properties on that block to just the value properties that are called EOL, end of life. Once we've done that, we can go from value property to default value. So that's going from end of life to 2030, and then literal integer to value. That's just getting it in the right format. So it's a literal integer, and so that we can compare it to this 2025. So now it's saying, is 2030 greater than 2025? So that's also true. So since A and B are true, then the entire thing would be true, therefore setting this IMU model 4.5 whatever to green. And you can actually do this. You can go to evaluation mode over here. This is a shortcut to be able to evaluate it a little faster. So I can change this. So remember, this is typically all of the elements on whatever diagram you're looking at. But instead of just taking everything, I can just find this IMU model. So I'll search that, IMU, and it's this one. So I selected it, and then I can evaluate it, and you can see that the answer is true. If I evaluated the other one, IMU, this last one down here, evaluates to false, as you would intend or expect. So that is the is active. The last year, this one is much simpler. and the fact that there's not two different things that it's looking for. Well, I guess there is two different things. There's that the beginning of life is less than 2025 and the end of life equals 2025. So this first one is just kind of like a error checker, and then the second one is meaning that it's the last year that's it's available. And so the only thing that I changed was I used a different behavior here, the equals, instead of the less than or the greater than opaque behavior. And that's just in the same drop down. So pretty straightforward there. Then we've got our legacy element. This one is going to check for the end of life is less than 2025 and the end of life is greater than 0. So there we go. That's just text. So I copy pasted and forgot to change the number appropriately. So this second one is just kind of an error checker. If you don't have this, then if you haven't redefined your value at all, then you can accidentally have this set to true, and then all of them will turn gray on your screen. So that's why we've got this kind of bounds in there. And then the future element, it's kind of more of the same here, where we're checking that that the beginning of life is greater than 2025. So we've got the greater than opaque behavior and then our normal MetaChains here. So now that we've made it through all these different active legends, how did I go about figuring all that out? And what I do typically is I will use some tables to help me kind of troubleshoot and make these. So I started with a value property table, make that a little bigger. And I filtered by the value properties that were within the physical elements package. So, and then I could have the owner of that value property, and I could do the default value, which is right here. And so essentially I'm making these new custom columns by hand to figure out how to get this true false set up. Once this true false Boolean works as I want it to, then what I can do is I can just go to edit, copy whole, and so I'm copying that entire MetaChain to a different location and then utilizing that. So I wanted to make sure that I could get to this true false table or columns right here. And then that made me confident that I was able to do this problem. So what I mean is we weren't starting with the value properties. Well, remember that when I keep saying this, I'm talking about the blocks. So our starting point is going to be the blocks and not the value properties. So I made this value property table, but really I need to start with the blocks. So I start with the blocks on this table, and then I can go to own member of the blocks. So that's this one. And I've got BOL and EOL. And then I can create a custom MetaChain that essentially filters out for just the BOL. And then that's that column. And then I search for just the EOL, and that's that column. And then I just like add one level of depth onto each one. So from this column, BOL to BOL value, all I did was I took all of the MetaChain that was in BOL, and then I added another MetaChain on top of it. So essentially, BOL is this right here. BOL, this column, is just this context find one. And to get from BOL to BOL value, I just went and added this wrapper MetaChain and went value property to default value. So it went from showing the entire value property to just showing the default value in this cell right here. And then I was able to, once I was able to access this value property, I was able to use all of the stuff that I learned from this first table and copy this less than one portion, and then I could paste it into this EOL less than 2025 and start, piecing the solution together. So I've got the end of life is less than 2025. Beginning of life is greater than 2025. So both of these are like not active states. So then I was able to say is active is basically any beginning of life that it was before the current year, and any end of life that was after the current year. Therefore, it would be set to true. This guy is set to false because it's the last year, 2025. You could argue that it is still technically active, but I just made it a little bit different and had a separate flag for if it was equal to 2025. I just called it last year, which is what you're seeing here. And then future element means that it's basically the MetaChain that you're seeing in this column, future element, is going to be exactly the same as the MetaChain that you saw here. The MetaChain that you see in legacy element is exactly the same as the MetaChain that you would see in this column here. So I use this table to help me understand all of the MetaChains and troubleshoot, and then I just pasted it into the legend items, and everything was good to go. Hope that example helped, and it will be available on our website to download. So go ahead and check that out. I'll leave a link below in the description.